We are exactly 2 weeks away from the deadline for teams to cut their roster down to 53 players. Can you believe that? 2 weeks, 2 preseason games left, but already 2 preseason games in the books to give us a better sense of who's making the cut, who's on the bubble, and who's on the outside looking in.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. Terms and conditions apply. On the show today, we bring an update on all of the biggest training camp roster battles across the Chicago Bears 90-man group as they're just 2 weeks away from cutting things down all the way to 53. A lot of ball game left, a lot of time for guys to try and still make or break their spot on the 53, but I think we've got a better sense now of like, okay, who are the guys that are definitely safe and who are the guys that are pretty much definitely out? And we can kind of narrow it down to like a couple of guys at a handful of positions that are very much still up for grabs over these final 2 preseason games, especially as early signs are, nothing official, but early signs are that we might not see any starters on Saturday against the Cincinnati Bengals, but then maybe the starters would play again against the Chiefs to wrap up the preseason. But I want to go through some of the positions where the biggest battles are still lingering. And as with a couple of these positions, there's some crossover here. Like, for example, I want to start at running back, where we know there's been a rotation in the backfield. We know who the starter is. We kind of know at the top of the depth chart, but trying to figure out exactly who they keep here. And now that you've thrown Velus Jones into the running back room, technically he played only running back in this last preseason game against the Bills. Matt Eberflus hasn't committed either way to say whether he'll stay at running back or go back to wide receiver. So it's hard to know whether he counts in the running back battle now fully or if he'll be back in the wide receiver battle. But when we look at the running back position in particular on this team, I think at this point it's pretty clear that DeAndre Swift, Roschon Johnson, and Khalil Herbert are all firmly safe on this 53-man roster. None of those guys are going to get cut. Maybe there's a chance Khalil Herbert could get traded, but I still don't think that's likely either. But he's certainly not going to get cut. So then it becomes a question of how many running backs do they keep? I think given that we expect to see Swift, Roschon, and Khalil Herbert all have some amount of a role in this Chicago Bears offense, it seems pretty likely that they keep 4 running backs, plus Kari Blasingame at fullback, but I'm not counting him in this specific discussion. We're talking halfbacks here. And so that kind of leaves Travis Homer versus Velus Jones. Both players I think of as on the bubble. Wouldn't shock you if they made the team. Wouldn't shock you if they were cut. Maybe you'd be slightly surprised about Velus Jones. Like, wow, okay, they're giving up on him or whatever. And Travis Homer has familiarity with this offensive coaching staff. So there's some surprise there too. But it's not like shocking, earth-shattering, breaking news kind of thing. And then your undrafted rookie free agent Ian Wheeler made some nice runs in the preseason game against the Bills, but like he's not making the 53-man roster. Strong practice squad candidate, but not making the 53-man roster with all the talent they have ahead of him in the running back room. I think we saw that, Swift is obviously the number 1 running back. Roschon Johnson was ahead of Herbert in the first preseason game, but Roschon didn't play in the second preseason game due to injury, we presume. So Herbert was really that next back, and they were relying on him a lot. And, we can criticize a couple of the runs Herbert made, but like they want that running back depth, and they're not just going to move on from that all willy-nilly. Travis Homer also got the first team reps in that rotation against the Bills. So I think he is ahead of Velus Jones. If you had to rank them right now, I think Velus Jones is behind Travis Homer on the running back depth chart. But when we're talking about number 4 running backs here, that's going to be largely a special teams role. You want them to be effective on offense. You want to trust that if you hand the ball off to them or put them as a receiver out of the backfield, that they can be effective in that way. And we think both Travis Homer and Velus Jones can do that. But the number 4 running back is going to make the team based on his ability to offer you special teams value either as a return man, which both of those guys can do, or on the coverage and blocking units around the return men that Velus Jones did a lot of last season and carved out a role doing, and Travis Homer has done more and more of as well. Like, I don't think this is not one that's easy to predict and call in either direction here and say, oh yeah, for sure, this guy's going to make it or that guy's going to make it, because you can count Velus Jones among the wide receivers as well. There's an outcome here where Travis Homer makes the team as the number 4 running back, and Velus Jones makes the team as the number 6 wide receiver or whatever. You can kind of find spots for both of them if you feel like, yeah, we really value Travis Homer as a special teams player and running back, but we still like Velus Jones as a special teams player as well, and maybe have him stick around instead of, say, one of the other wide receivers, where I think there's a handful of guys that are locked in, kind of the obvious names, and then a whole lot of wide open jobs for grabs at wide receiver. Even with Tyler Scott's mistakes in the last preseason game, I think he is safe along with Keenan Allen, DJ Moore, and Rome Odunze. Those 4 wide receivers, you can put them in pen on your 53-man roster. They're not cutting Tyler Scott, even if he has some ups and downs across the preseason. But those are the only 4 to me that, as of today, August 13th, 2 weeks ahead of the August 27th deadline for the 53-man roster cutdown, those are the only 4 that are totally 100% safe, for sure going to make the team. I think DeAndre Carter is probably ahead of a lot of the other guys here in that mix. He's gotten a lot of first-team reps and is also one of their first choices as a kick returner. I would guess Carter could make the team, but Velus Jones could beat him out. I think those two maybe are fighting for one roster spot at this point, but we'll see how that plays out. And then you got guys like Dante Pettis, Simba Webster, and the Hall of Fame game hero Colin Johnson, who have all gotten some level of either first-team reps or made big plays in Colin Johnson's case, but Simba Webster played with the first team in the Buffalo Bills game, and Pettis has been a first-team player on this team, also a punt return starter on this team before, so like he's in this mix. And Colin Johnson was effective on special teams in the Hall of Fame game, but he was hurt for the Bills game and didn't play at all. We presume he was hurt because he didn't play at all. And so what those 4 receivers, Carter, Pettis, Webster, and Johnson, do over the next 2 preseason games is really going to go a long way to determining who is in the number 5 and number 6 wide receivers on this team, presuming that they keep 6. And Velus Jones is also in that conversation if they move him back to wide receiver or determine they want to keep him as a wide receiver, or how they sort of justify that across the board. But I do think the likes of Freddie Swain and undrafted rookie free agent John Jackson, who's one of the close friends of Caleb Williams, I don't think at this point either one of them is really firmly on the bubble or in the mix there. I think they're likely on their way out. I would predict that Colin Johnson will not make this 53-man roster no matter what he does in the preseason, because you can still stash him on the practice squad pretty easily here. I think it wouldn't, like, it's not out of the question, but I think it's unlikely that Johnson makes the 53. And like Simba Webster was getting first team reps, but like it would be a little bit of a surprise to me if he makes the leap all the way up to the top. But he seems to be the guy who's pulling ahead a little bit now, whereas like feels like Pettis' role has been shrinking more and more throughout the preseason. So we'll kind of see it. It's a messy kind of position here. After the top 4, it could be Carter and Velus Jones. It could be Carter or Jones, then plus one of the other guys who's ever best on special teams between Pettis and Webster and Johnson. But so much of that is all going to depend on, and same with the running back spot, who is your kickoff returner and who is your punt returner. If Carter does both, Velus Jones is gone. If Khalil Herbert could be your kickoff returner, or Tyler Scott could be your kickoff returner, and then who do you keep? Could you get special teams value out of a player who also gives you more offensive value than Carter or Velus Jones? Those, to me, are going to be the biggest questions that still linger over these final 2 preseason games. How does the return game and the other special teams roles as well, how do those start to impact what this 53-man roster is ultimately going to look like? So that's what we'll be keeping a close eye on with those 2 skill positions. But I want to turn our attention next to the trenches, where we're getting a better sense of who the backup offensive linemen are going to be, but it's a question of how many the Bears keep. And I think the defensive line rotation is clearing up a little bit, and there's only a couple of spots that I think are between 2 or 3 guys that are fighting for 1 or 2 spots. So we'll look at both of the trenches before we turn our attention to the defensive backfield as we continue this episode of Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. I'm on LinkedIn. I bet you're on LinkedIn. And if you're not a member of LinkedIn, a lot of your coworkers, friends, and even family members are all part of LinkedIn. And that's what makes it special, because LinkedIn isn't just a job board. It helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open if the perfect role presented itself. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So hire professionals like a professional with LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Special teams is going to shape out who makes the Bears roster on the offensive skill positions where the big battles still remain. Special teams, much less of a factor for the guys in the trenches, not really a part of the offensive line discussion at the very least. A little bit on defensive line we'll get into in a minute here, but we've seen so many injuries on this Bears offensive line this preseason, this training camp, that who they keep as the depth is going to be particularly important, because we've seen Nate Davis miss a bunch of practice. We've seen Darnell Wright miss a few practices. We've seen Braxton Jones miss a few practices, and Tevin Jenkins as well. All 5 of your starting offensive line positions have had injuries to the starter missing practice, Ryan Bates included at the center spot. So who you keep as a backup are going to be players that perhaps even likely will play at some point in the regular season. Maybe not, hopefully not all of your backups all at the same time, but a few of them at the very least. And I think based on how they've deployed the offensive lines in the 2 preseason games, we have a pretty good sense of who the top backups are. And then it's a question of how many are they going to keep and who's going to crack that 9th offensive line spot. So when you think about the Hall of Fame game and the Bills game, whether they've played the starters or not, it's been very clear that Larry Borom is their top backup offensive tackle. He's played both left and right tackle in the preseason. He's been their first choice off the bench at both spots. When Braxton Jones was hurt, Larry Borom filled in at left tackle. When Darnell Wright was hurt, Larry Borom filled in at right tackle. He is the swing tackle on this 53-man roster. Braxton Jones, Darnell Wright, Larry Borom locked in as your top 3 offensive tackles. At guard, we saw Matt Pryor got the start at right guard with Nate Davis out and Ryan Bates out. Matt Pryor clearly their top guard choice off the bench. He's played almost his entire preseason on the right side at right guard and right tackle. Hasn't done a lot on the left side, but has played left guard before in his career, and he's definitely your swing guard. So, locked in Tevin Jenkins, Nate Davis, Matt Pryor. Maybe Nate Davis ends up on injured reserve or whatever, but he's not going to be cut. He's safe in 53-man roster cut downs. And then we know both of your centers, Ryan Bates, Coleman Shelton, they're both going to be safe. They're making the team. Whoever the starter is, the other one is going to be the top backup. So that's 8 safe offensive linemen, 3 tackles, 3 guards, and 2 centers. Maybe the Bears will only keep 8 offensive linemen. That could be your whole offensive line. Borom, Pryor, and then Shelton or Bates is whoever, and your backup center. That's all your backups, because then Borom can play guard and tackle. Pryor can play guard or tackle. Either Borom or Pryor can play left tackle, left guard, right tackle. Some positions better than other for each of them. Borom more of a tackle, Pryor more of a right side of the line guy, but both guys have experience playing any of the 4 offensive line positions. And so if you have 2 backups that can cover 4 spots, maybe you say, that's enough. Or maybe you say, well, Tevin Jenkins has an injury history, Nate Davis has an injury history, and both Braxton Jones and Darnell Wright have been injured at training camp. We better keep at least 9 offensive linemen, and maybe if Nate Davis is hurt or if someone else starts the season hurt, do you have to keep 10, even if it's just temporarily there? That's going to be spots that you have to cut from somebody else. So I think if you wanted to keep another offensive tackle, which I think is probably less likely, Jake Curhan is the one who's definitely on the bubble there, well ahead of Aviante Collins, who I think is as good as cut at this point, but still, some depth to have there. At guard, I think Jatari Carter would be the next, the 9th offensive lineman on this group would be Jatari Carter. He's been your top left guard. He even played a little bit of left tackle in the Hall of Fame game. They've been experimenting with his versatility. He's been around this team for a couple of seasons now, has some in-game regular season experience, and I think that puts him well ahead of Bill Murray, the other backup guard, and Jerome Carvin, who's been kind of the 3rd-string center and also 3rd-string left guard ahead of Doug Kramer. But I really think Carter's probably offensive lineman number 9, and then it'd be between Jake Curhan and Bill Murray for offensive lineman number 10. But because Curhan can play guard a little bit too, so there's some versatility there, but I don't think they're going to keep 10. I think it's only a question of, do they keep Jatari Carter as the 9th offensive lineman, or do they stick with 8? And maybe the alternative here is that at 53-man roster cutdown day, they claim another offensive lineman on waivers to then take Carter's spot as the 9th offensive lineman, or however they end up piecing that together. That's actually probably what I think is most likely to happen, that they'll keep 9, but the 9th offensive lineman will be not a member of this current training camp roster. Kind of like when they traded for Ted Larson not Ted Larson. That's a name from the past. When he traded for the Dolphins lineman, it's not Ted Larson. His name is good. I'm looking it up as I'm talking here, but his name is going to come to me in a sec. Dan Feeney, 3-letter first name, 6-letter last name, both white guard/centers. Totally the same person in my mind. When he traded for Dan Feeney last offseason, I don't think Ryan Poles is going to trade the same way again, but I think they'll add someone at the very last minute who can be another quality depth player that was cut from someone else's team. It wouldn't surprise me if Ryan Poles did the same thing on the defensive line, where, again, you kind of get a feeling like the top 3 guys at the 2 defensive line spots, end and tackle, are pretty well set, and then it's a matter of how many of each do you keep. We're for sure going to see Montez Sweat and DeMarcus Walker make your 53-man roster. Of course, they're going to be your starters, and Austin Booker is having a great preseason, and he's a rookie 5th-round pick. He's locked in too. Those 3 are for sure safe as defensive ends. The rest of the defensive ends, I don't think anyone is truly safe. I'd probably put Jake Martin in front there, but he also hasn't played at all in any of the preseason games, so we haven't seen him out there. So, you can't make the club in the tub. Is that Dominique Robinson's spot to then surpass Martin? Martin, sorry, you're just not out there to help the team, so we're going to let you go and stick with Robinson, who had a much better game against the Bills than he did against the Hall of Fame game. Who did they play in the Hall of Fame? The Texans in the Hall of Fame game. We'll see. And then Daniel Hardy is the other defensive end, really still in the mix there on the bubble, who also made some nice plays against the Bills. And Daniel Hardy, among the backup defensive ends, has done the most special teams. Number 92, if you watch on punt returns and kickoff returns, he's blocking on those units for the return men. He's been out there a lot. And I think Daniel Hardy is a sneaky dark horse player to make this 53-man roster as your 4th defensive end ahead of Dominique Robinson and Jake Martin. And then, Khalid Kareem and Jamari Croma, I think, are pretty well out of the mix at this point, barring something really major happening throughout the rest of the preseason. But I also see both defensive end and defensive tackle as positions where 53-man roster cutdown day comes, a good defensive end or defensive tackle on another team gets cut, becomes available. The Bears sign him as their 4th defensive end, or perhaps their 4th defensive tackle, where, again, I think top 3 guys locked in. Andrew Billings, Javon Dexter, Zach Pickens, set to go on your 53-man roster. And then for guys under contract right now, it's really Byron Cowart versus Michael Dwumfor for that 4th defensive tackle spot. The other 3 undrafted rookie free agents, Keith Randolph, Deshaun Mallory, and then they just signed a Jalen Hutchings on Sunday or Monday, I forget which day that actually was, that they added another undrafted rookie free agent defensive tackle. I think 1 or 2 of them will be on the practice squad, but not the 53. So it's really, Cowart had the big Hall of Fame game with the forced fumble, the strip sack, but then missed the 2nd preseason game. So Dwumfor got some more playing time in that and made a little bit of noise there, but not quite the big time splash plays. But injuries go a long way in determining who's going to be that 4th defensive end. So I think if Cowart comes back here and plays out the rest of the preseason, he's probably that guy. If Cowart misses a bunch more time and Dwumfor can hold it down, he's probably that guy. And either one could lose their job to a free agent the Bears sign or claim on waivers after the 53-man roster cutdown day. So I think both of these spots are fairly solid. Both of these, the O-line and D-line, are fairly solid at the top. And it's a question of how many backups do they keep and who can still win out that final backup spot, or will they be replaced by someone outside the organization? That threat of an outside player coming in is definitely not the case really almost anywhere else on defense, where I feel like your depth is pretty well stacked, but there's still a pretty open battle at cornerback where we know the top 4 guys, but there's been a great battle going on throughout training camp and the preseason on who's going to be cornerback 5 and 6, kind of like wide receiver there, where it's anyone's game and it's going to be special teams based. And I also want to look at where the special teams competition crosses positions, where you'll have a running back battling a wide receiver, battling a cornerback, battling a safety, all for maybe the same roster spot for their special teams contributions. We'll look at where those battles are going to be the most fierce next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. We're talking LED headlights, roof racks, exhaust kits, superchargers, and more. So whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you want at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. The most of the Chicago Bears defense outside the defensive line is pretty well set in stone. You know, maybe the last linebacker spot is sort of up for grabs, but I don't necessarily want to talk about six-string linebackers, and like same kind of thing at safety where Elijah Hicks and Jonathan Owens are pretty clearly your top two backups there, and then it's a question of do they keep a fifth, and then that's kind of wide open. But again, we're talking the very, very bottom of the depth chart there for players that are not going to play at all on defense and only, be special teams guys. So we'll talk some special teams in just a minute here. But in terms of like depth players who you might actually see, one injury away from really getting on the field is at cornerback, where much like wide receiver, the top four pretty well locked in. The next two or three wide open, and it's anyone's game. And the next two preseason games are really going to determine a lot of that. So you've got, of course, your starters, Jalen Johnson, Tyreek Stevenson on the outside, Kyler Gordon in the slot, locked in. And then Terrell Smith, the fifth-round pick from last year, 2 years ago now, is pretty clearly the top backup cornerback. I think those four guys are all really safe, locked into their 53-man roster spot for pretty obvious reasons. Then it's up to Jalen Jones, Greg Stroman Jr., and Josh Blackwell, who all have a really good shot at the 53. But I don't know that you're going to keep all three. Typically, you keep 6 cornerbacks, sometimes 5, and every once in a blue moon, you could keep all 3 and keep 7. But usually you would need somebody to be injured, which, Tyreek Stevenson and Kyler Gordon are both injured right now, and Kyler Gordon's been injured for a couple weeks. We expect both of them to be ready to go for the regular season. But if someone's not ready to go for the regular season, that's your path towards keeping 7 and keeping Jalen Jones, Greg Stroman Jr., and Josh Blackwell, all 3 on this 53-man roster. But most likely, you get to keep 2 of those 3, Jones, Stroman, Blackwell. And I couldn't tell you right now. This is absolutely wide open. Jalen Jones and Greg Stroman have both been playing outside and slot, where Blackwell's been a lot more of just a slot-focused guy, which I think hurts him a little bit more. But Blackwell has also been the most consistent special teams player of the 3. And when you're talking about your number 5 and number 6 cornerback, their primary role is helping out on special teams. You also need to be able to trust them if you have a cornerback injury and need to put one of those guys in, but their day-to-day biggest impact is on special teams. And Blackwell may have the initial leg up there. We've seen Jalen Jones and Greg Stroman on this 53-man roster before, Blackwell as well. Like, these guys have all been around. They've all had contributing special teams roles. I don't know how you're supposed to really separate them at this point. They've all played pretty well this preseason. They've all made some plays. They've all been involved on special teams. This one is a total crapshoot. And like, when we do a final 53-man roster prediction at the end of the preseason, unless there's an injury to one of them, this is a coin flip for me. I really don't know. I tend to lean that Blackwell misses the roster and they keep Jalen Jones and Greg Stroman. Gun to my head, I have to pick some combination there. Fine, it's Jones and Stroman in, Blackwell out, but I don't feel very confident in that, and I think that can change a lot over the next 2 weeks. The other undrafted free agent young cornerbacks on the roster, Reddy Stewart, Leon Jones, Ro Torrance, I don't think they've got a shot. Reddy Stewart was in the mix on the bubble for a little bit there, but I think he's fallen off a little bit and is going to be a practice squad guy for sure, but not a guy that I think has a real shot at the 53-man roster at this point, because there's just so much talent ahead of him on the cornerback depth chart. But like I said, so much of this is going to come down to special teams. And it's not going to be purely, okay, Blackwell versus Stroman, because it's all the special teams players competing for that role on Richard Hightower's units. So it's like Blackwell versus Stroman versus, the safety, Adrian Colbert, who could be the fifth safety, who's played a lot of special teams this preseason. Would you rather keep a fifth safety or a sixth cornerback? If they're both competing on special teams, who's the better special teams player? Or Micah Baskerville at linebacker had the pick 6 against the Bills. Quality special teams player as well, but do you keep 6 linebackers when they typically only keep 5? Well, it depends. Do you keep 6 linebackers or 5 safeties? Daniel Hardy on the defensive line, Steven Carlson as a 4th tight end. Do you keep a 4th tight end versus a 5th safety versus a 6th linebacker? It depends on who's better on special teams and can help your team out in more ways than just the position that's listed next to them on your depth chart. Throw Colin Johnson in that discussion, throw Velus Jones in that discussion, Travis Homer. You've got 10 or so guys at a bunch of different positions across the roster that are not only competing at their own position, but competing with all these other 10 guys for those roles on special teams. And if you can say, no, I'm the best gunner on this team on punt coverage, I should make this 53 instead of that player at a different position who's not as good of a gunner as I am. That's a great way to make this team and change the math a little bit on, we wouldn't normally keep 5 safeties, but you're too valuable for us on special teams that we're going to keep 1 fewer player at a different position to keep you at your position because we need you on special teams. And that's how any of these kind of guys we've been talking about can find their way onto the roster, even if they're not one of the 5 or 6 best players at their respective positions at playing their side of the ball that's not special teams. So again, these next 2 preseason games are going to go a long way for that, especially because I'm not at this point not expecting to see the starters against the Bengals. We'll see what Matt Eberflus says this week. The Bears are practicing on Tuesday and then Wednesday. Then they have a joint practice with the Bengals on Thursday. And the Bengals head coach Zach Taylor has already said he's not expecting his starters will play against the Bears because of the joint practice. Last year, when the Bears had a joint practice against the Colts and then played the Colts, Matt Eberflus sat his starters for that game because he said the joint practice went so well that he doesn't need to see the starters play in that preseason game. Given that the Bengals aren't playing their starters and the Bears have a joint practice and a history of sitting their starters after having joint practices, through all of that math, I say it's unlikely that we'll see Caleb Williams or the starters against the Bengals, but then they will come back and play again against the Chiefs in the final preseason game. When we get an announcement for sure, you can be sure that we're going to break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast and preview this Bears-Bengals matchup. So make sure that you hit the subscribe button, whether you're watching along on YouTube or listening in your favorite podcast app. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're looking to make a second listen, stick with us here on the Locked On Podcast Network and go check out Locked On NFL. It's our daily show covering the league as a whole. I was a fill-in host on today's Locked On NFL with Luke Braun, where we talked about Hassan Riddick putting in another trade request now to leave the Jets. We talked about all the rookie quarterbacks' debuts, Caleb Williams, J.J. McCarthy, etc. We talked about those and kind of compared and contrasted those. And then Tuesday, Locked On NFL always has our yike and like of the week. Things we liked, things that made us say yikes from the NFL this past week. We talked a little bit of Aaron Rodgers, a little bit of Tyreek Hill, talked about kickoffs, and what was the 4th thing that Luke said? I can't remember. But go check out Locked On NFL to find out what it was. Coming back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears, where we'll talk about everything that happened in the episode 2 of Hard Knocks. And of course, we'll always leave you with another opportunity to bear down.